Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. On Monday, I did an interview with the former director of the Intelligence Bureau TV, Rajeswar, to mark the launch of his book, India, The Crucial Years. In the interview, Mr. Rajeswar spoke extensively about Indira Gandhi. He spoke about the emergency, he spoke about her personally, he spoke about Operation Blue Star, as well as the Sikh agitation of the 1980s. Many people thought that his remarks were perhaps unnecessary. Some even thought they were derogatory. Many thought they were astonishing. My guest today has asked to have a right of reply, and we've agreed. Few people have worked as closely with Indira Gandhi as my guest. From 1962 to 1984, he was her personal assistant, just beside her right through the years of the emergency and right through her prime ministership. Since then, he went on to become a government minister, and he is today a permanent invitee of the Congress Working Committee. He is, of course, R.K. Dhawan. Mr. Dhawan, let's start with some of the personal things Mr. Rajeswar has said about Indira Gandhi. After that, I'll come to what he says about the emergency, and after that to Operation Blue Star.
Anything you like.
And let's start with what I call the mystery of the missing M.O. Mathai chapter. When M.O. Mathai's book, The Reminiscences of the Nehru Age, was published, Chapter 29 was missing. There was a publisher's note which said the author had withdrawn it at his request at the last moment. Subsequently, the publisher Narendra Kumar said that was just a teaser. The chapter itself didn't exist. Now, in this book written by Mr. Rajeswar, he proves the chapter does exist. He found it, he's discovered it. How do you respond to that revelation?
Well, I must say at the outset that Mr. Rajeswar's book is self-glorification. So far as your point is concerned about the chapter, it is preposterous narration. Mr. Rajeswar says that this note was given to him by the Chief Minister, Mr. Ramachandran, Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu. Well, the whole country knows that Mr. Ramachandran was very close personally and politically with Mrs. Indira Gandhi. And if he had to give such a sensitive note, he would have given himself to the Prime Minister, not to the Director of Intelligence Bureau.
Let me repeat to you exactly what Mr. Rajeswar writes in his book. He says somewhere in early 1981, when he was Director of the Intelligence Bureau, he called upon M.G. Ramachandran, who was at the time Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu. Mr. Ramachandran gave him the M.O. Mathai chapter. He took it, he gave it to the Prime Minister, who accepted it without saying anything. Why can't you believe that story?
There is no question of believing this story. As I told you, the first thing that there is no such note existed.
You deny the existence of the chapter itself?
Absolutely, there is no such note, and no such note was given to the Prime Minister. As I said earlier, Mr. Ramachandran, who was very close to Mrs. Gandhi politically and socially, might have given himself such a note if it existed. He would not give it to the Director of Intelligence Bureau. Another astonishing thing, let me complete it. Another astonishing thing is that Mr. Rajeswar, in his interview with you yesterday, day before yesterday, said that he did not read it. Even a, I must say, layman, uneducated man, would it believe that the Director of Intelligence Bureau is given a note and he doesn't read it and hands it over to the Prime Minister?
So you're saying to me that TV Rajeswar is lying?
Absolutely, there is no truth in it, and he's lying.
But tell me this, why would the Director of the Intelligence Bureau lie about something that happened 40 years ago when he today is 89? What does he gain from lying?
I must say he wants his book to be sensational. Otherwise, there is nothing in the book. If he doesn't write such thing, who will bother about his book? And if you go through the newspapers, they have only reported about only this item.
A second personal comment made by Mr. Rajeswar about Indira Gandhi is that he says when she returned to One Safdar Road in 1980 after getting re-elected, 3 days of non-stop puja were held, and some of the most important ceremonies were held in the room where Sanjay and Maneka Gandhi would stay.
Well, when Mrs. Gandhi shifted to One Safdar Road, Mr. Rajeswar was not the Director of Intelligence Bureau. He became Director of Intelligence much later. And there is no question of any. Mrs. Gandhi was, of course, a religion. He respected all religions. But there was no such puja, I know. When she shifted there, I know it there. Absolutely, there was no such puja. The only puja which she attended was this Navaratri puja many years ago, I think in 70 or 79, at the residence of Mr. Kamalapati Tripathi. Beyond that, there was no such puja.
So you're saying to me that in 1980, when she returned to Ansaftuja Road, there was no puja, and no puja for 3 days, as Rajeshwar says.
Absolutely no puja, and Mr. Rajeswar is also his figment of imagination.
Once again, in fact, not figment of imagination, you're saying he's lying.
He of course says he's lying.
Now, a third thing that Mr. Rajeshwar says is that Mrs. Gandhi, he says, was very suspicious and very questioning, particularly on issues of loyalty and trust. His exact words are, she believed rumors when it concerned loyalty and trust.
Here also, because Mr. Rajeswar has been indulging his association with extra constitutional authorities, with which I will deal later. And I am telling you that she would not say, open her mind and say something to the Director of Intelligence Bureau. She had much more important agencies, much more important close person, Mr. R.N. Kaur, who was a security advisor. She would not say such things to Mr. Rajeshwar.
So you're saying to me that Mr. Rajeshwar is not as close to Mrs. Gandhi as he claims, therefore he cannot know that she believed rumors, particularly rumors to do with loyalty and trust.
Absolutely, he functioned only as a Director of Intelligence Bureau. He was not at all close. She never she never mentioned personal or important matters to him.
She never mentioned personal or important matters to him.
Yes.
So if he suggests that he was close to her, that he was a confidant in some sense, again you're saying he's lying.
If you say lying goes with it, of course he's lying.
One other thing, and perhaps this is the most important, in his book, Mr. Rajeshwar confirms, or reveals rather, that Indira Gandhi used the IB and RNAW to snoop on Congress people. His exact words are, and I'm going to quote, she used the IB and RNAW for reports on men and matters, including reporting on Congress people. Did she use intelligence agencies to survey her own colleagues?
She did not. She had her own sources of information, from political sources of information. Mr. Kaur was there, Rao was there, other agencies were there.
Did she use RAW to snoop on Congress colleagues?
She would not. She had her own system of intelligence.
But this man was the director of the IB. Surely he would know what he's talking about.
No, there were such matters are, if at all have to be referred to, they are referred to the Chief Vigilance Commissioner. How would the Director of Intelligence know who is corrupt, who is not corrupt, or why shouldn't to
Not checking corruption. She may have simply wanted to find out what people were doing, what they were thinking, whether they were loyal, whether they were trustworthy or not. And she may have, in that capacity, for that purpose, used the Intelligence Bureau and RAW.
No, there is no question of Mrs. Gandhi using him. It's a job of the Intelligence Bureau. The Intelligence Bureau on its own does all this swooping and all that checking and keeping an eye on the people.
But now, Mr. Dhawan, you're actually agreeing with him. All you're saying is that the Intelligence Bureau snooped on Congress on their own, not at her behest.
I didn't say that. I say it is the job of the Intelligence Bureau to keep an eye on various activities going on in the country and to report. This is the main function of the IB.
But you're saying to me categorically that Mrs. Gandhi did not tell the IB or RAW to snoop on congressmen.
Absolutely, she did not say. And the first thing, there was no need for her to get snooped because her source of information were entirely different. She used to meet two people 2 hours in the morning every day. She used to visit in various states through the country, and she used to get feedback from the congressmen, feedback from the public, and various other sources.
So on 4 counts, and I'm summing up this part of the interview, on 4 counts you've said that Mr. Rajeshwar is wrong, tantamount to lying. First of all, you deny the existence of the M.O. Mathai chapter, you deny that he gave her the chapter, you deny that he received it from M.G. Ramachandran.
It's not only a question, I say main thing is that Mr. Ramachandran would not give such a note to Mr. Rajeshwar.
That's why you question the story.
If at all it existed.
That's why you question the story.
And as I told you, to end this story, and end this chapter, I can tell you that no such note was ever given to Mrs. Gandhi.
How do you know that?
Because I would have come to know that.
Why? She might not have shown it to you.
No, such things was definitely shown to me. Personal things were definitely mentioned to me.
But this chapter allegedly was about her love affairs, her love affair with M.O. Mathai. Why would she show it to you?
No,
she didn't want it seen by anyone.
If it comes to her through Director of Intelligence Bureau, then she would certainly like to show it to me and tell it what has happened and make inquiries how it has reached his ends.
And you have no knowledge.
And Mr. Rajeswar did not mention this to her, that this was given to her by the Chief Minister.
All right. So there are 4 counts on which you say he's wrong, tantamount to lying. The Emo Mathai chapter story, the puja at Safdarjung Road before she moved back,
Absolutely.
the fact that she believed rumors to do with issues of trust and loyalty,
Yes.
the claim that she used IB and RAW to
Yeah.
snoop on congressmen.
Yes.
All 4 you're saying are wrong, tantamount to lies.
Tantamount to lie, the word used, that's the word you have used it, but I am saying they are absolutely wrong. There is no truth in that.
Let's then come to what Mr. Rajeshwar in his book India the Crucial Years has to say about the emergency.
Yes.
He says that the list for people who had to be arrested was drawn up in the Prime Minister's house. He says instructions were given telephonically. He says some chief ministers were summoned overnight by special planes to Delhi and given the arrest lists personally.
There is absolutely no truth in it. As I told you in my earlier interview with you, that the action about emergency or about certain measures to be taken was being contemplated much before the emergency was declared. The chief ministers were warned that some stern action because of the prevailing situation in the country has to be taken, so they should prepare the list. So there was no question of giving the list of persons to
I'm stopping you.
No list were the persons to be arrested was given to the chief ministers.
No lists were given to the chief ministers for persons to be arrested.
Yes, no list.
Were the chief ministers or some chief ministers summoned overnight by special planes?
Not at all.
Were the lists drawn up for people to be arrested in the PM's house?
The list, of course, was certainly prepared by Mr. Kishan Chand, Mr. Binder.
In the PM's house?
I mean, say whether they made it in the PM's house or whether they made it in their own office, I don't know. But these lists were made by them. These lists were known to Mr. Bansilal, Mr. Siddharth Shankar Ray, and the main person who were knowing about the list were Mr. Kishan Chand, the Lieutenant Governor of Delhi at that time, Mr. Naveen Chawla, and of course they discussed it with Mr. Sanjay Gandhi.
So you're saying 2 very important things.
Yes.
You accept that lists were drawn up,
Yes.
but you're saying they were drawn up by the individuals you've named.
Yes.
You're saying they weren't necessarily drawn up in the PM's house.
Not at all.
Not at all.
This at all, I don't know whether they're drawn up in the PM's house or drawn up somewhere else.
The second important thing you're saying is that no lists for arrests were handed to the chief ministers and no chief ministers were summoned by special plane overnight.
As I told you myself, I contacted the chief minister on the declaration, after the declaration of emergency, and I told them that emergency has been declared, so you please take effective measures as contemplated earlier.
As contemplated and intimated earlier. So no chief ministers were summoned, no lists were given.
No
that's what you said earlier, that's what you stand by.
No such list was given.
Given lists by the PM.
Absolutely no chief minister was given the list by PM or by anybody else in Delhi.
A second thing that Mr. Rajeshwar says about the emergency, he says that Indira Gandhi was fully aware of the excesses. She knew about the slum clearances and destruction at Turkman Gate. She knew fully about the family planning and sterilization excesses. He says the IB regularly briefed her, and secondly, there were many people who met her every day who would have told her. She was fully in the picture.
As I told you in my earlier interview, she knew nothing. When the Turkman Gate took place, she was out of Delhi. When she came to know, she was apprised of this. Even when she was there, she was apprised of the situation. But all this action was taken by Mr. Kishan Chand, the Lieutenant Governor of Delhi, Mr. Bhinder, Mr. Tamta,
Can I interrupt?
And the main person who was responsible for it was Mr. Jagmohan.
Can I interrupt at this point?
Yes.
In the interview you gave me in June to mark
Yes.
the anniversary of the emergency, you
Yes.
categorically said to me that Indira Gandhi was not aware of the excesses either of slum clearance and Turkman Gate or of family planning and sterilization. Rajeshwar says to me that R.K. Dhawan is wrong. Rajeshwar said to me in the interview on Monday that the IB briefed her regularly, quarterly and half-yearly, and secondly, there were people meeting her every day who were telling her she knew about everything happening.
Absolutely, there is no truth whatsoever in what Mr. Rajeshwar is saying. The IB used to send reports. No such reports were ever sent to her. They all used to be signed reports. Mr.
How do you know no such reports were sent
Because
to her by the IB?
I used to go through all those reports.
So Mrs. Gandhi made IB reports available to you?
Of course, there were IB reports not only made available, I used to read out the IB reports to her. While she is working, she was doing something, she used to do 3 things, 4 things at a time. And she will say, go and write the reading. Says, all the IB reports were read out by me to her while she was doing other work. Even if I start for a minute, so she'll say, why you have started? I say, you are doing this. She says, I can do 3 things at a time. Here, listen and what you go.
And none of the IB reports mentioned the excesses of the emergency at all. You're saying that to me?
None of the IB reports, I challenge Mr. Rajeshwar on this point. Then none of the reports mentioned excesses.
So when Mr. Rajeshwar says R.K. Dhawan is wrong, you're saying Mr. Rajeshwar is wrong?
Mr. Rajeshwar is totally wrong. Just he wants to only glorify himself in this book.
Now, Mr. Rajeshwar also says that Indira Gandhi was fully aware that Sanjay Gandhi was exercising enormous powers from inside once after the Jung Road. She knew that he was giving instructions to ministers and bureaucrats. The only thing Mr. Rajeshwar says is that perhaps Mrs. Gandhi didn't realize that this was unconstitutional and wrong.
No, Mrs. Gandhi did not come to know much that was happening. As I have told you earlier also, there were certain officers who, in their self-interest, used to come early in the morning before the IE or any other member of the staff was there, take instructions in that manner.
From Sanjay.
In that manner, I would say certainly that Mr. Sanjay was using unconstitutional powers. But these were the officers who were taking unconstitutional orders from him.
But did Mrs. Gandhi know this was happening? After all, it was happening in her home.
Mrs. Gandhi did not know in detail all that. They said
she did not know in detail.
She did not know in detail. She only knew that these officers do meet him and brief him about certain happenings.
How could she not know in detail? After all, Sanjay was living in her home. These officers were coming to her home. How could she not know in detail?
Well, she was the Prime Minister. She had a lot of other things to do. And Mr. Sanjay Gandhi would not tell her. Or she would not ask Mr. Sanjay Gandhi as to what you are doing or to what for this officer has come to meet you.
On Monday, when I was interviewing Mr. Rajeshwar, I said to him that Mr. Dhawan denies that Mrs. Gandhi knew that Sanjay was exercising unconstitutional powers. And once again, Mr. Rajeshwar said to me, R.K. Dhawan is wrong.
Well, I cannot comment. Mr. Rajeswar is free to say anything he wants to say. But as I have told you, Mrs. Gandhi did know that certain officers do come and meet him.
But that's all. She didn't know the full story.
She didn't know the full story.
Was Mrs. Gandhi, by your own account, naive, or was she deliberately turning a blind eye?
She was not turning a blind eye.
So she was naive?
She was not naive also. She was not being given brief properly.
Who failed to brief her properly?
The IB failed to brief her properly. The officers could...
So in fact, you're now blaming the IB and Mr. Rajeshwar, who is head of the IB, for not briefing her.
Of course, certainly.
So far from Mr. Rajeshwar being accurate in claiming that Indira Gandhi knew everything about Sanjay, you're saying Mr. Rajeshwar and the IB failed to brief her, which is why she didn't know.
Mr. Sanjay Gandhi, Mr. Rajeshwar was very close to extra constitutional authorities. He would not say anything that would go against Mr. Sanjay Gandhi or make Mrs. Gandhi unhappy. He was very close, taking orders. Mr. Rajeswar was taking orders, briefing from unconstitutional authorities, Mr. Arun Nehru, Mr. Fotedar, Mr. Sanjay Arun Singh and others. So therefore, Mr. Rajeswar dare not go and report to the Prime Minister because he himself was taking orders from unconstitutional
In other words, you're saying he had very good reasons for not telling Mrs. Gandhi about Sanjay's role because he himself was involved in taking orders from unconstitutional authorities.
That is what I'm saying.
Welcome back. You're watching an episode of To The Point. My guest is R.K. Dhawan, perhaps the person who was the closest working with Mrs. Gandhi right through her years as a politician and Prime Minister, commenting on TV Rajeshwar's book, which has been released earlier this week. All right, let's come to something else Mr. Rajeshwar says about the emergency. He says that Bala Sahab Dioras, who at the time was the Sangsar Chalak of the RSS, and I'm now quoting Mr. Rajeshwar, quietly established a link with the PM's house and expressed strong support for several steps taken to enforce order and discipline in the country.
There was no such direct mention to the Prime Minister. He might have mentioned it to the IB, or IB people might have come to know, but no such thing ever came to the notice, or at least to my knowledge, no such thing.
This is very important. You're saying to me that to the best of your knowledge, Bala Sahab Dioras did not establish a direct link to the PM's house?
Yes.
You really mean that?
I really mean that to the best of my knowledge, he did not establish a direct contact with the Prime Minister. He might have made a contact with the intelligence, because intelligence agencies, their officers were dealing with those persons.
But if he made a contact with the intelligence agencies, that means he made a contact to either Mr. Rajeshwar or one of his subordinates, but not to Mrs. Gandhi, not to the PM's house.
Not to Mrs. Gandhi, not to Mr. Sanjay Gandhi, not to PM's house.
Now, in fact, Mr. Rajeshwar goes one step further. He says that Bala Sahab Dioras wanted to meet Mrs. Gandhi, he wanted to meet Sanjay. Mrs. Gandhi refused because she didn't want to be seen to be close to Mr. Dioras.
I have no knowledge about it.
None. If you have no knowledge, does it mean this didn't happen, or could it be possible it did? You just don't know.
Could be either thing.
Rajeshwar goes one step further. He says, and this is very important, he says that the RSS specifically conveyed its support to the Congress and to Mrs. Gandhi, that they would support her in the post-emergency election. That means that in 77, when the post-emergency election happened, the RSS would have been quietly supporting Mrs. Gandhi, whilst the Jan Sangh would have been with the Janata Party opposing her. Now, can you confirm or deny this?
Well, the fact is known. Jan Singh Party was nothing. It depended only on RSS. How could RSS say that they will support Mrs. Gandhi and not Jan Sangh? Jan Sangh came into existence because of the RSS, and they were not two separate entities. So absolutely to say that RSS will, there were no such mention, there were no such thing. Then when we went for election...
I'm interrupting you because I want you to be clear.
Yes.
You're saying to me that Mr. Rajeshwar is wrong when he says the RSS promised support to Mrs. Gandhi in the post-emergency election.
Absolutely wrong.
Absolutely wrong.
Absolutely wrong, and I must say, I do not know what has happened. Is it I should give credit to him for his age or his memory? Why he is saying all those things which did not happen?
Many people who were around at the time, including Subramaniam Swamy, who wrote an article in the Hindu in 2000 to mark the 25th anniversary of the emergency, actually claimed that Balasaheb Deoras did offer support, that he did write letters to Indira Gandhi, that he did want to meet her. You're denying all of it.
No such letter was received. No such, because all those letters regarding emergency, I used to come to know about them. No such letter was received, and as I have told you, not to my knowledge, whether any IAB officer was contacted by or Deoras contacted.
But no direct contact was established between Balasaheb Deoras, Mrs. Gandhi, Sanjay Gandhi, or the PM or the PM's house.
Absolutely no.
You are absolutely certain.
Absolutely underlined capital.
You sure this didn't happen without your being informed?
Of course, nothing. I mean, say anything that used to happen during emergency, I used to come to know of it.
Now, Mr. Rajeshwar also says that at least on two occasions, first in January 1976 and then again sometime around August, September 76, the IB recommended to Mrs. Gandhi that A, the emergency should be called off, B, political prisoners should be released, and C, elections should be called. Mr. Rajeshwar says to me in the interview that Mrs. Gandhi was inclined to agree, but Sanjay put his foot down and said no.
This also is figment of imagination of Mr. Rajeshwar. Mr. Rajeshwar was only a joint director at that time. He was not the
senior-most joint director.
Senior-most joint director. And senior-most joint director never met the Prime Minister. Mind it, it was only the Director Intelligence Bureau used to meet. Mr. Rajeshwar was not the Director Intelligence Bureau at that time. And there are no such recommendations by the IB. The IB might have verbally spoken to various officers, PN Dhar or others and all that, about which I have no knowledge. But so far my knowledge goes, in the beginning of 1976, rather people were clamoring that there should be emergency, it should have been declared much earlier. So where is the question of IB recommending in January 1976 that the emergency should be removed?
So this claim that the IB twice recommended that the emergency be revoked, political prisoners be released, elections be called, you're saying is not true.
It must be only in Rajeshwar's mind. Nowhere on the earth, nowhere, anywhere in the record.
Once again, you are absolutely sure?
I'm as sure as death.
As sure as death?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Rajeshwar also says that when elections were called and Jagjeevan Ram broke with Mrs. Gandhi and joined the opposition, Mrs. Gandhi was taken completely by surprise.
Of course, she was taken by surprise.
Completely by surprise.
Completely by surprise, because we were having a meeting of the parliamentary board and we were waiting for Mr. Jagjeevan Ram to come. When the meeting did not come for 10 minutes, she asked me to find out. I rang up his residence. His residence private secretary told me that yes, he is just leaving. But that didn't happen. After 10 minutes, we got a letter from him resigning from the party, resigning from party member or working committee and that. So that did surprise Mrs. Gandhi.
Now the other thing Mr. Rajeshwar says in his book is that a week before the results came out in 1977, the IB had informed Mrs. Gandhi that she was going to lose heavily and badly in the Hindi belt.
That also must be in Mr. Rajeshwar's stomach. He was not also, as I told you at that time, Director Intelligence Bureau. Director Intelligence Bureau never gave any such report. The officers never gave any report. Rather, there were reports. And I told you, Mr. Siddharth Shankar Ray wrote a letter on the 16th of March that we are going to get 325, 340 seats based on the survey he has got, as people have got conducted. So where is the question of that IB saying?
So there is no question of any report from the IB a week before the results saying she would lose heavily in the Hindi belt?
I think to make the book sensational, Mr. Rajeshwar has gone astray.
Finally, on the emergency, and in particular on that election of 1977, Mr. Rajeshwar says that as the results were coming out, and I'm quoting him now, frantic efforts were made to resurrect and revive Mrs. Gandhi's electoral fortunes in some manner. He says that then Home Secretary S.L. Khurana tried to contact the returning officer in Raebareli and ask him to order a repoll. The returning officer, to avoid pressure, went missing deliberately.
Here also Mr. Rajeshwar is totally wrong. I am telling you, I rang up myself, Mr. Mathur, S.N. Mathur. He was the director of Intelligence Bureau. I asked him about, he told me that Mrs. Gandhi is losing very badly. She is far behind Mr. Rajnarayan. I went and told Mrs. Gandhi that you are far behind and you are losing, about to lose, your results are going to be announced. And she said, okay, thank God, I'll have some live moments to myself. And there is no question of, I mean, say, does Mr. Richard think that the people in Rashtrapati, Prime Minister's house, were so fools or so uneducated that they will know that Mrs. Gandhi is lagging behind and then it can be redone and all that? I mean, say, is he, I mean, say, gone his head off or what?
But he says that S.L. Khurana, he names him, S.L. Khurana, the then Home Secretary, tried to contact the returning officer in Raebareli.
S.L. Khurana might have told Rajeshwar, or Rajeshwar might have spoken to him. So far as the Prime Minister's house was concerned, there was absolutely no effort on the part of anybody to see that something else is done. When the results are coming, when we know that she is losing very badly, how we will say such a thing?
Finally, I said to Mr. Rajeshwar in the interview on Monday that when I had interviewed you in June, you
Yes.
said that Mrs. Gandhi welcomed the news of her defeat. There was relief on her face.
I still repeat it. That's what I'm
Mr.
saying.
Rajeshwar says that can't be true.
Well, Mr. Rajeshwar was not there. It was a conversation between me and Mr. There were no cameras by the IB at that time, and especially in Prime Minister's house. So Mr. Rajeshwar was only a joint director. So how would he know what happened and what didn't happen? I mean, say he was only, as IB goes on, gathers the information from here and there and sends a report. So he must be believing in those reports.
So once again, to sum up this part of the interview, just as you said, all the personal comments Mr. Rajeshwar made about Mrs. Gandhi were wrong and tantamount to lies. All the things, virtually all the things he's written about the emergency are wrong and, as you put it, a figment of his imagination.
Yes, are failing in his memory because of his age. I would like to add something. If you give me something. Mr. Rajeshwar has failed to mention in his book his role as to what he was doing when the opposition leaders were having meetings and when Mr. Rajnarayan was meeting his liars, how Mr. Rajeshwar was conducting, snooping on them and reporting so that it can be helpful to our liars. Mr. Rajeswar has failed to mention that when Mrs. Gandhi was in London, he used to send daily reports to her against Mrs. Maneka Gandhi. That escalated the conflict between the two. When Mrs. Gandhi arrived at the airport, Mr. Fotedar entered the aircraft before she could step down and said something, and that led, you know what happened, is a matter of fact. And then he has failed. And I have told you that as a once a lieutenant governor also, he before going, he was dealing with the, I must say, hobnobbing with extrajudicial authority. But as a governor, he even then at that time, he continued to write to Mr. Fotedar saying as to what should be done politically in Andhra Pradesh. A governor is supposed to send a report to the president concerning his own state which he is governing, or with a copy to the Prime Minister. A governor has no means constitutionally to send a report on the other states or political affairs, and that too also to unconstitutional authority. So here I am telling you that Mr. Rajeswar did not give up his activities of dealing with extra constitutional authorities even when he was governor.
But you've now said two very important things, and I'm going to ask you to reconfirm them before I take a break. The first thing you said is that Mr. Rajeshwar, as head of the Intelligence Bureau, was snooping on Raj Narayan,
No,
Or
he was not head of the bureau. He was joint director.
As a joint director of the bureau, he was snooping on Raj Narayan and reporting back to Mrs. Gandhi's lawyers what Raj Narayan and his lawyers were discussing, and this presumably is in the run-up
No,
to
he
the
never used to report.
Allahabad judgment.
No, he used to report to me.
He used to report to you?
Yes.
So in other words, he and his organization would snoop on Raj Narayan and Raj Narayan's lawyers and then report to you.
Yes, he
so
used
that
to.
you could pass it on to Mrs. Gandhi's lawyers.
Yes.
And this
But
is
we ignored it.
and this is clearly illegal and wrong.
Absolutely illegal.
And the second thing you said to me was that when Mrs. Gandhi was in England, Mr. Rajeshwar, presumably at that point he was in fact DIB, was actually monitoring Maneka Gandhi's affairs and
Yes.
reporting directly to Mrs. Gandhi in London.
Directly sending a report daily. He said Mrs. Gandhi, Sonia Gandhi is doing, Maneka Gandhi is doing this. She is hobnobbing with this person. Dumpy is doing this. She is removing boxes from the Prime Minister's house. All those reports he used to send them daily.
And this made Mrs. Gandhi's relationship with Maneka much worse.
Much strained.
In other words, he instigated and, as they say in Hindi, chabi lagaud.
More than that, chabi lagao is a minor word.
When you say more than that, what do you mean?
I must say that it's escalated. I must say if he had not sent the, if he had sent the
He
objective,
is responsible for the breakup in a sense
to an extent.
between Mrs. Gandhi and Maneka.
To an extent.
Let's now come to some of the important things that Mr. Rajeshwar writes and says about the Sikh agitation of the early 1980s. He says then Punjab Chief Minister Darbara Singh and then Union Home Minister Gyani Zail Singh had a very strange relationship with Bhindranwale. He says that they were at times acting to protect him, at times they even prevented his arrest by the police, that Mrs. Gandhi had her suspicions, but because she didn't have proof, she couldn't act against them.
Well, Mr. Darbara Singh and Mr. Gyani Zail Singh did not have good relations amongst themselves. So what they were doing, what they were not doing, whether they were supporting Bhindranwala or not Bhindranwala supporting, or who was supporting or not supporting, is not known to me. But the fact remains that the relations between the both of them were not good.
But were they, and this is the critical question, were they acting to A, protect Bhindranwale, and B, at times even to prevent his arrest by the police? Is that true?
Now, how can I say that? I said not to my knowledge, because it was mentioned in the circles that Mr. Gyani Zail Singh is supporting Bhindranwala. On the other hand, it used to be that Mr. Darbara Singh is linked with the Akalis. So these are all rumors. There are no facts known to anybody and all of us.
Did Mrs. Gandhi have her suspicions of Darbara Singh and Gyani Zail Singh?
No, she knew very well that the relation between the two of them are not good.
But did she suspect that they were acting in a dubious way to help Bhindranwale?
No, she did not suspect. If she had suspected, she would have taken action long ago. She was not to wait for her to ask for anybody.
So when Mr. Rajeshwar says that Indira Gandhi had her suspicions, you say he's wrong.
Absolutely wrong. As I have told you, he wanted to make his book sensational.
Now, Mr. Rajeshwar also says in his book that he gave Mrs. Gandhi a 4-page note advising her that the only way of creating lasting peace in Punjab was for an Akali Congress coalition to be formed. He says after she got the note and she read it, she invited him, she spent a long time questioning him, but eventually she didn't heed his advice. Was such a note ever given to her?
Well, I have no knowledge about it. I do not like that, say, or deny it and all that. He might have given it, he might have discussed it, I don't know. But the fact remains, how do you expect a Prime Minister to ask his own Chief Minister to resign and give the reins to a Akali Chief Minister? And what sort of recommendation he had made? Had he gone off his head to make such a recommendation?
But if he had given a 4-page note making this recommendation, would you have seen it?
No, because it did not come down, I didn't see it.
You didn't see it?
I didn't see it.
So in this instance, at least, if there was a note given, it wasn't shared or shown to you?
I have not, it might have been given to Principal Secretary because the Punjab affairs were being dealt with. But I was not dealing with Punjab affairs, mind it. The Punjab affairs were being dealt with by Mr. P.C. Alexander, Mr. Cabinet Secretary Mr. Swami Rao, and Mr. Rajiv Gandhi. She might have given it to Mr. Alexander.
Now, one other thing. Mr. Rajeshwar says that on the 27th of May 1984, which is almost exactly 1 week before Operation Blue Star started, he met Mrs. Gandhi and very strongly recommended against Operation Blue Star. He says in his book, he told her, and I'm paraphrasing, that the worst violence, the worst bloodshed since partition will happen if you go ahead.
Well, he used to meet her at times. He might have mentioned it to her verbally. There was no such note. He might have mentioned to her verbally.
He claims that a note she gave him was circulated to the Cabinet Committee on Political Affairs.
Absolutely wrong. I used to make the agenda of the Political Cabinet Committee The agenda used to pass through me.
You made the agenda for the CCPA.
Yes, I must say, no, agenda used to pass through me.
And there was no such note given by him circulated to them.
No such note was circulated. And I might tell you, Mr. Rajeswar might not be knowing, that Mrs. Gandhi would never circulate such a note to the members of the this Political Affairs Committee of the Cabinet. Such things are always mentioned verbally in the political. So many things used to happen in the Political Affairs Committee which were not even on the agenda.
Finally, Mr. Rajeswar says that Mrs. Gandhi didn't realize, didn't appreciate the consequences, the terrible consequences of attacking the Golden Temple.
Well, I have told you on my earlier interview, Mrs. Gandhi did realize Mrs. Gandhi was totally against it, absolutely against it. But Mr. Chief P.C. Alexander, Mr. Home Secretary and the Cabinet Secretary, they forced her, and Mr. Chief of Army Staff assured her again and again that nothing damage will be done to the Golden Temple. They will only flush out the terrorists and Mr. Bindrawala, and she was not at all inclined about it. And when it happened, when it was reported to her, she was very unhappy.
But you're saying two things. First of all, you're saying she fully realized the consequences of attacking the Golden Temple. To say she didn't appreciate and understand is not true.
Absolutely not true. As I told you, she knew all those things, but then you have to go by the advice of the Chief of Army Staff.
And you're saying to me that in fact the advice given by the Chief of Army Staff of the time that there would be no damage done,
yes,
eventually convinced her to go ahead.
Yes.
And that advice turned out to be false because terrible damage was done.
No, terrible damage was done because then she asked them. But they say because once the army takes action, then it depends upon the circumstances at what level at that time happening, because Mrs. Gandhi was a Prime Minister in her room, in her office. And army always takes action depending upon the ground situation. The army assured her, but when the army knew that there are so many soldiers of their own have been killed, more are being killed, and they have not been able to do anything, so they did attack.
Rajeswar said to me in the interview on Monday that the army used helicopters and tanks without seeking prior permission from Mrs. Gandhi.
Mr. Rajeswar is, I will say again, I know I should have consulted dictionary. Okay, what should be the alternative for figment of imagination? You can suggest.
But again, you're saying this is not true.
Mr. Rajeswar, I will sum it up by saying Mr. Rajeswar has tried to glorify himself. He has tried to tell all lies. He has tried to make his book sensational. He was dealing with extra constitutional authority. All that, his promotions as governors and all that, it depended only because of a proximity with the extra constitutional authorities. Even as a governor, he was using his position to interfere in the political affairs of other countries. And even as governor, he was dealing with extra constitutional authority.
My last question, on a whole series of counts, whether we're talking about personal comments made about Mrs. Gandhi, whether we were talking about the emergency, whether we were talking about Operation Blue Star and the Sikh agitation of the 80s. On a whole series, you've not only disputed what Mr. Rajeswar has said, you said it's a figment of his imagination. At times you said it's tantamount to lies.
Not a tantamount, so there are lies.
You stand by all of this?
I stand by all of them.
Suppose Mr. Rajeswar tomorrow says this is libel and wants to sue you.
Let him sue me. That is no problem.
But you stand by all of this?
What I have told you, I stand by it.
And you also stand by, because this is very important, the denial that Bala Sahib Deoras made any attempt directly to contact the PM's house. You stand by that?
As I told you, I stand by it because no such thing came to my knowledge. There was no such paper, no such mention. If some IB officer knew about it, they might have mentioned it to somebody. But if it had been mentioned to Mrs. Gandhi or to Mrs. Sanjay Gandhi, I would have come to know about it.
All right, Mr. Dhawan, a pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure.